Alrighty, artists. So what we're going to focus on for our first technique is the realism portion of our drawing. So we talked a little bit yesterday. One of the things we talked about is how realism is quite literally exactly how it sounds. You're trying to capture the object as realistically as possible. In these examples here, you can see some examples as we go back into history of realism in the 1850s into 1900s. These are all very well experienced painters who realistically portrayed how light reflects off of objects and really, like I said, capturing those objects as realistically as possible. You can see in the mirror here how the details and the shadows, the highlights of all of these objects are perfectly captured. With realism, one of the things that I feel is really important is that you are observing the object. So you shouldn't be trying to add color from memory. So for example, if you're drawing an apple, yes, we all know that an apple is red. However, if you were to actually look at an apple up close, it's not just red. You see different tones of red. You see dark red, light red, medium red, and you may even see some green and yellow tones in there, maybe even brown, if we look closely at the actual photo of the object. So when you're drawing your object, you need to have a picture of that object in color, or you need to have that object sitting right in front of you so that you can pay attention to where you see darker areas, where you see lighter highlights, where you see the medium tones, and where you see different shades of color. So where do you see those dark reds, medium reds, and light reds? Where do you see these really bright highlights? If you don't have a reference photo up, this isn't going to go as successfully for you. So again, realism is probably closest to what we call naturalism, so capturing that object as naturally as possible. It will not appear abstract or supernatural. It's going to be very realistic. Colors and shadows will appear realistic if you are really focusing on observing that object. You're trying to capture its full anatomy, the way that the light reflects off of the object, and portray that in a realistic way in your drawing. So when you're looking at your object, I am going to show you my example here. If I were focusing on the realism section right in here, I have my palette sitting right in front of me, or I could have a photo of it up on my Chromebook, like a Google image. And one of the first things that I'm going to consider is the highlights and the shadows that I see. So realistically, if we look at each little paint area, ironically you can see one light little reflection that reflects in every single part of the paint here. So I see these little highlights. What I would do is draw these things in first exactly in the shapes that you see them. So I'm going to go in and add that highlight here. It's kind of a funky organic shape, and then it's a little bit lower in my orange, and I'm going to add in where I see those highlights before I even get going here. So you're really looking, paying attention to every small detail. This one even has 3 little highlights, and the yellow is what I'm focusing on here. In my green, there is a little highlight here on the bottom, and then also one on the top as well. I need to pay attention to these because I'm not just doing a flat green in here. I obviously have, light reflecting off of my object in certain ways. With my blue one, I have one on the top here, and then one lower that's a little bit more skinny. And then in my purple, which looks kind of super dark right now in this light, I have a small one at the top, really skinny one down here, and then on this one, the same concept, just adding in those little teeny highlights. So once that's finished, I have kind of a realistic idea of what that looks like. The other thing too is I'm noticing that you can see the side of where the paints are. You can see there's like a little stripe that goes down here. I'm going to add that in really quickly. And that will probably be almost a light blue or gray tone. And in some areas I even have the paint is kind of smudged on the palette, so I can add like the realistic little yellow dot of paint here. It looks like the yellow was used, and I'm going to add that little section of paint where the yellow kind of splattered onto the side here. All of those little details should be included as well. My orange has the same thing. See a little orange dripped out here and around. And also my red. Once I have those details in, I can kind of get going on this. So if I were to start on my red section here, this is almost too light of a red to use. I want even more of a violet in there. So what I might do is mix a little bit of my dark purple to create some of the super dark areas. So for example, if I start with my red, I'm going to apply the lighter tones first, remembering to leave those little highlights white, and use a darker version of red to do the outline, because what I notice is there's a shadow. It's really, really dark around the edges of the paint here. So I'm going to even take a little bit of purple and really darken the edges here. Mix a little bit of my red in with that purple. If I ever want to mix two colors together, I can use kind of a circular motion for that. So if I wanted to darken that a little bit more, circular motion to blend those two colors together really helps. It's looking pretty good. It just needs to get a little bit darker near the inside here. And then even like these little paint splotches, they're a little bit darker on the edge and a little bit lighter towards the inside. So I'm going to leave the inside of those a lot lighter, where the paint kind of came out of the palette here. Now I have to accurately portray these little shadows around the corner. To me this looks like a light gray or maybe even a light purple. For a shadow I might use a light purple for that and just really lightly add a shadow around each of my colors. Just to do this little line that's around each one, and I have to pay attention how thick that is. You can see the shadow is darker on this side and you can barely see it over here, so it gets a little bit thicker on the top edge here. Like that. Now I can move on to my orange, and then what I might do is, I notice that my orange looks a little red orange here, and again it gets super dark towards the edge, so I need to pay attention to where that color gets darker and apply a little bit more pressure in that area, and then a little bit less pressure with my colored pencil around the inside where it is lighter. And all of you have different objects, so you are going to be using your eyes to fully analyze each of your objects. Where are the darker colors and where are the lighter versions of the color? That's all I'm doing right now and trying to translate that onto my drawing here. If I want to make my orange a little bit darker, like I said, I'll go in and using a circular motion and light layers, just kind of blend a little bit of red on the edge of my orange to make that appear even darker. So instead of using like black to add shadows, you can use color for shadows. So you can apply, if I wanted a light orange, I can just apply a little less pressure to my colored pencil, or I could use just a regular orange for the middle and a darker color like red towards the outside to get that shadow. And then if I look at these little paint splotches, this area is really light and then part of the paint splotch is really dark, so I'm paying attention to that too. Kind of outlining the outside in red where it's really dark. leaving it light, or I can go back and add a little bit of orange. Then I again have that little shadow around the ridge of that, where maybe I could use like a purple tone or a light gray to add that little shadow on the side here. Before moving on to the next one, got a little paint splotch up here too. Leaving my highlights white where the paint is. This purple color also is like what I'm going to use for the shadow. It's just going to be slightly purple, the shadow. So like right in this area, what I might do is really lightly add that shadow that I see in here to the edge of my palette here. Darken that at the edge. Have it get lighter towards the middle. And then that shadow gets darker in the middle here, so I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure there. Lighten it up a little bit towards the outside. Kind of like that. Still a little bit darker in here. So just work in layers. Don't press your pencil down so hard. You can always add more layers if you want it to be darker. It's looking pretty good. And when I go and do this side, I'm going to apply the shadow along the outside of the palette here. But before I even do that, I'm going to continue adding my colors here. So again, working with my yellow, this is really bright, and then I have some darker areas. I might be able to use a little hint of brown to create some darker tones for my yellow. So when I go in and do that, I have to be very careful with the brown because it's a very dark color. So if I want to add shadows to my yellow, I need to be working with super light layers to add those shadows. So like right in here, I notice it's a little bit browner down at the bottom. I'm going to add really light layers when I go and do that with the brown in a circular motion, trying to blend those colors. And this is kind of a cool brown, so if I wanted to warm it up, that shadow a little bit, I can always add some orange to it if it gets too cool. So I could go in and add a hint of orange to warm that up, like I said. Here. Starting to look like a shadow along the yellow. And there's a shadow going along the top here as well. And it's lighter towards the middle. And then I'll go in again, take my purple and add the little shadow around here. Really lightly. And continue on through my colors. So again, artists, you're really paying attention to where are the dark areas, where are the light areas, and how am I going to portray that accurately, even down to the little shadow that I see in these little paint splotches on the side of the palette. Really have to use your eyes for this and analyze that object fully. So you want to see this a little bit closer up. That's what it's looking like. So you can see some areas are darker, some areas are lighter, and I'm really blending those colors together nicely to create a smooth gradient, is what we call that. A smooth gradient from dark to light, in order to make it appear as if those little paint splotches are reflecting light. So look at your object, pay attention to where you see the darker and the lighter areas, and as you're working through your objects today, if you have any questions, you can always let Mrs. Stelke know while you're working today too. So have fun with it and try drawing it as realistically as possible.